Well, welcome back to It's an Inside Job podcast. I'm your host, Jason Lim. Now, this podcast is dedicated to helping you to help yourself and others to become more mentally and emotionally resilient so you can be better at bouncing back from life's inevitable setbacks. Now, on It's an Inside Job, we decode the science and stories of resilience into practical advice, skills, and strategies that you can use to impact your life and those around you. Now, with that said, let's slip into the stream. Well, welcome back. I am very glad that you could join me for a new week. And this week, I am joined by Agnes Cserhati. Now, Agnes is an internationally recognized speaker, trainer, consultant, and a qualified coach with over 25 years of experience of working in both private and public sectors, developing, designing, and delivering successful programs, workshops, and keynotes with specific focus on leadership, transformation, and mindset. Now, that name might sound familiar if you were a regular listener to this podcast. Well, Agnes was first joined me on this podcast in Season 1, Episode 9, so that was quite a few episodes ago. But since I received such great feedback, I definitely wanted to invite Agnes back. Now, Agnes and I, we collaborate on a number of different levels, working with clients and organizations. And it's through our collaboration, we see people grow and develop and learn and to become more resilient, and however resilient shows up for people. And for me personally, that's very rewarding. I don't want to speak on behalf of Agnes, but I am sure she would concur. And so we want to take that conversation, that work we do, and to bring it more regularly here on the podcast. So I've asked Agnes if she will join me once a quarter, once every few episodes, to have a conversation, to share our knowledge, share our experience, and share the stories and the growth and the development that we see in clients and organizations. And it's through those dialogues that you, dear listener, perhaps can pick up a skill or a story or strategy that will help you on your road to development and growth. So without further ado, let's slip into the stream and speak with Agnes Cserhati. I'd like to welcome you, Agnes. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you for having me back. It is really a pleasure.
And there's two things we want to talk about today, and just to touch base on, because we can't go into the full scope of things just because of the limited time of a podcast. But let's kick off our conversation talking about leading self, because I think with these sort of turbulent times, with the energy crisis and the looming recession that's going to affect us and have cascading effects both on an individual organizational level, the geopolitical strains that we're facing right now, we're constantly barraged by knowledge and news about climate change. I think personal resilience, or the ability to lead yourself, is core to everything we speak about, and I think it's core for everybody. So I was wondering, perhaps we could kick off by you telling us a little more about your perceptions and your take on leading self.
Well, leading self is not just a sort of terminology that I use because it sounds good. I genuinely and passionately, and you know that, I'm a great believer of it, and hopefully people who know me, listeners who know me, as I walk the talk as well. So for me, I work with very high-performing individuals, and for them, mental resilience is an extremely powerful source of competitive advantage. But it is for all of us, it's not just at work, in everyday life as well. I think it's important to understand, and I keep saying this, and I will say this again today, that resilience for me is not about being tough and emotionless. I hear this very often when I meet customers, clients, or neighbors, people around. They say, you know what, Agnes, I'm not that resilient. And I ask them, well, what makes you think that? And they say, because I'm not tough. And I said, resilience is not about being tough. It's really about how quickly can you turn things around to recover confidently and recover, and perhaps we come back to that a little bit later, not necessarily just for negative things, but recover from something unexpected, perhaps didn't go how you wanted, and moving forward that fast. So that really gap and time and that to come back to optimum performance. That is resilience for me in a nutshell.
And I think, leading self comes back down to the heart. Leading self is personal resilience. And how we learn about resilience is actually through experience. Whether that experience is positive or negative or however we want to characterize it, the question is, how do we learn from that experience? Because it's the learning, it's the mining of from that experience that adds to personal resilience. Because at the end of the day, it's the things and situations that we go through that shape who we become. And so we don't have to just randomly let that happen to us. We can consciously and cognizantly take those lessons and ask ourselves, how do we put it to practice? Because for me, the personal resilience is three things. There's self-awareness, there's self-compassion, there's self-efficacy. But I'll just touch on the first one because I think it comes back down to what you said. And I think that's self-awareness. And if I just elaborate on that, self-awareness for me is two steps. There's the awareness, because every human moment, it's broken down into three things. It's our thinking, our feeling, and our behaving. And self-awareness, well, that's taking it one step deeper than just being aware. So aware is like, okay, what am I doing at the moment? What am I thinking and what am I emoting? Self-awareness is about, okay, I can back engineer. Why am I behaving this way? And then I can back engineer, and that will lead me to emotions. And my emotion is, okay, I'm feeling anxiety, I'm feeling exuberance, I'm feeling excited, I'm feeling irritated. Well, what is the reason for that? And because within the emotions, that becomes information in which I can deal with something. Because a lot of the times, Agnes, we talk about emotions, many of us as positive or negative, but you and I have talked about this many times, is that emotions are just a spectrum. And within those emotions, because emotions are the body's way or our physiology, it's the grammar, it's the syntax in which it communicates to our brains. But those emotions aren't directives. They are information. And when we become self-aware of that information, of what that anxiety or that excitement is communicating to us, well, then we can take more precise actions, what we actually want to do. And so for me, I think that's really a strong step. I mean, what's your take on being self-aware?
I'm glad that you mentioned emotions and being conscious, of course, as well, is really, really important. I think when we self-aware, and it's this critical part of it, is really the sooner, of course, easier said than done. And this is why we're doing this. So people become self-aware, leaders become self-aware and make their teams and organizations self-aware sooner than later. The sooner you become self-aware, the more resilient, the better you can move forward. And I always say that, the best way to navigate stress, uncertainty, is to develop your ability and your team's ability to choose one thought over the other. And why is it so important? Because what we don't want is to proceed further into the world of meta emotions. So what we don't want is that, you have to allow yourself to feel. So if you had a bad meeting in the morning, it is perfectly normal that you feel perhaps less satisfied, that may even feel sad. But I think the difference when we can tap into and use our resilience and being self-aware of it and saying, hold on, is there meta emotion? Well, meta emotions is having emotions about emotions. Have I already proceeded that I felt sad and upset, but now I'm actually guilty, feeling guilty about sad and upset because at this stage of my career, I should be able to handle a meeting. So this is this critical time point, I think, where self-awareness comes in and resilience can tip things over to moving to that optimum performance and perhaps not to mess up your next meeting or your next presentation.
And I think that is a perfect segue into, a second component I usually talk about is that self-compassion. Self-compassion is understanding those emotions and understanding that emotions rise up. They're not dangerous for us, but they can feel uncomfortable because it's like almost putting on virtual reality goggles, VR goggles. It colors and tints everything we see. But once those emotions, those chemicals that make up those emotions are metabolized out of our blood system, all of a sudden we start seeing the world in a different perspective, a different way. So our reality is dependent upon the chemicals swimming through us that we call emotions. But for me, self-compassion is just that, we can get down by, let's say we, as a team, we didn't do too well if we were trying to promote a project to another department, and we thought, oh, that didn't go so well. And we can get really self-critical, or the team can turn that criticism on themselves in a very harsh way, where we don't learn, we penalize ourselves. It's almost like self-flagellation, where we're whipping ourselves. But I think self-compassion is just that. It's being kind and understanding, okay, what did we learn from this? And I think when it comes to our own personal resilience, self-compassion to me is very important. It's to understand that this is part of a human experience, that millions upon millions of people have felt what we have. They've had to a sense of failure, a sense of struggle, but it's part of that transformation. And I think if we take that on and that reframe it, Agnes, in such a way that, a lot of people have gone through this. It normalizes the situation. It doesn't reduce the significance of it. It is a significant situation we're going through. We can learn that, other people have gone through this, millions of other people, and they've come out on the other end. I just need to be kind to myself, or the team needs to be kind to themselves to learn to adapt. What's your interpretation of self-compassion as you see it when it comes to leading self?
I mean, when it comes to leading self, and and perhaps many of the audience also do as well, that in my 5+1 model, this is the +1. And it's a +1 because this is where you start. And I not because I had no idea where to start, because if you can't lead self, you can't lead others successfully. So I start with being kind to self. And I often ask my clients, and I'm asking the listeners here also to ask, when was the last time that you were kind to self? And also, how are you kind to self? Do you even know? And you might think, this should come naturally. Well, I think our brain is very busy. You all leaders, busy individuals. So expecting that it somehow happens to us, I think, as you pointed out earlier, it's very, very unrealistic. The other thing that I often point out about this element is that this is not about perfection. So being kind, also expecting yourself that you won't get everything right all the time. And it doesn't matter how successful, how experienced you are. So having realistic expectations and managing your energy on focusing on what you can control and influence versus everything else that is not in our control is so critical to that self-kindness, self-management that you so eloquently explained earlier.
No, I think you made such a salient point. It's about having realistic expectations. It's managing those expectations. It's managing our energy. And again, it's where we place our attention. In the span of this conversation, we can't go into the science of attention, but attention is everything. We never run out of attention, but when we're running low, our focus can be on the things that we don't control. And I think for me, working with people with us or working with individuals, it's about self-efficacy. It's the ability to have that belief that we can do something about that situation. But without self-awareness, understanding where we are emotionally, behaviorally, and cognitively, our thinking, well, we can't do that. And if we're not self-compassionate, saying, okay, how do I learn? How do I adapt from this situation? Whether it's a good situation or a bad situation, but if we just classify it as an experience, Agnes, I think self-efficacy is so important. As I like to say to a lot of clients, it's about having an ace up your sleeve. And it's about pulling that ace out when you need it. And ACE is just a simple acronym for autonomy, certainty, and effort. And so autonomy is the ability for us to consciously focus our attention. And autonomy is just that. We want to focus on what you just said, Agnes, on things that we control and things that we can influence. And when we focus our attention in this way, this reveals to us how we can act, how we can influence our situation. And what I've seen time and time again, once a person feels that they can act and do something about their situation, even if it's just to change their perception of the situation, this fuels self-confidence and it squashes self-doubt. And so the second letter in the acronym ACE is C, and that's for certainty. And certainty is that we focus our attention, again, we are disciplined to focus our attention on the facts and the reality of the situation. We don't get lost in assumptions and we don't get lost in speculation. And at the same time, it's to pay heed to our emotions. As we've talked about earlier, emotions are just informations that are not directives commanding us what to do. Emotions are a signaling system to our psychology that we perceive a situation in a certain way, that there is information that we can use to make more coherent decisions, to take more defined action. And I think the last one is what you said. It's about effort. It's about where can I take action? And that means I need to take responsibility and ownership for the situation that I'm in. Not that I am to be blamed for the situation, but the situation is here, whether I invited it or it's shown up on my doorstep uninvited. The question is, how do I take ownership to deal with this? And it may not be a positive situation in any way I cut it. It may not be positive, but I need to take a constructive mindset to move through it. Does this kind of resonate with you, Agnes?
Absolutely, it does resonate with me. And you know, when you said the mindset move through it, I also like to kind of circle back a little bit, because perhaps we work so often together that I think we take things for granted here. But I think many, perhaps for the listener's perspective, I think it's critical to understand that there are different types of resilience that exist. And why is it so important that we start with self and developing? There is a sort of natural resilience that we all born with, and it's your human nature and it's your sort of life force. Now that, as a coach, unfortunately at this stage I cannot change. You can also, yeah. There is the adaptive resilience that we so often hear about. And I think this makes a good media story. That's why we so often hear the adversity now. And when individuals went through challenging circumstances and they learned to adapt. It's important because this is how, of course, research and science understood how human can change their thinking and do that. But however, what we're talking about here is learned resilience. So learning techniques. So we're not changing your natural resilience. We're not changing your adaptive resilience. We don't know what your background is, what you have experienced. But what we're saying is that you can learn techniques to help to build your resilience. And this is what I often call this sort of, you're building, exercising your resilience muscle. And the good news here is that whether your natural, adaptive, or your learned resilience is higher, I want you to imagine it as a resilience tank, and they actually compensate for each other. So you do not have to have an adverse background to be resilient, that I hear so often. And I wanted to share this for your listeners, for our listeners here. It is not necessary for it. So it's also a critical part of that self.
I think also a very important part that we've talked out in front of clients, it's not always the negative, but you speak a lot to success but having resilience in success. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. At the beginning, I very deliberately said that it's not just about recovering from adverse and negative event. It's really the recovery. So I think many of you can probably identify that. What about when you got the job you always wanted? What about when you got the Olympic gold that you worked for, probably the entire life for? But how then? What then? What's next? And how do you win your second one? So there I think in schools or perhaps in self-help courses, we don't talk about what happens when you succeed. That is also an important part to tap into your resilience, because you're going to go for your second Olympic gold with the perception that somebody's going to describe you as, here is the previous Olympic medalist. Let's see if he or she can win a second one. If you're going for the next executive role, this used to be the CEO of so-and-so organization leading so many people. So the expectations are there. And I think that often also leads to that kind of stress thought process, not because of the negativity, but because it's a challenge. And again, what we said at the beginning, managing one thought over another, becomes critical here as well. And this is less talked about. I think it's probably less attractive for media or for research as well, because it's associated with success. But I work with a lot of you as well, a lot of high performing people. And this is the everyday life. It is critical to understand that when I achieve that certain point that I always wanted, I then don't let go. This is where I need to tap into my resilience to actually move forward and perform and be the leader that you're meant to be. I think that's important to understand.
I think that's such an astute point, because in that coin of success, we can call it that, there's two sides that I kind of experience. It's like an individual, a team, or a department. They succeed at something, and it's like surprising. We've achieved everything that we've wanted. But if we bring it back down to the individual, he or she may have achieved something, and it comes a little bit as a surprise. They get their promotion, they get the bonus, they get the kudos and the recognition, the accolades for that. But sometimes what I think is very important when it comes to the resilience of success is understanding that sometimes it comes on as a surprise for people, and that can lead to something called imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome, as you and I have talked about many times, is just that. It's like a person emotionally believes that, what am I doing here? They must have made a mistake. Someone's going to discover something. Logically, that person knows that they've worked hard, that they've earned their place at the table. But emotionally, they feel maybe like a fake or a fraud. And someone just made a simple accounting error of something and put me in this place. And so this sense of failure comes off, or this sense of perfection. I have to live up to this. But I think this comes back so much back to your point, Agnes, about success and the resilience of understanding from that success, that learn from your success. What did you learn from it? How did you get here? Then all of a sudden you become cognizant that these are the facts and the realities that took me, he or she, to that point. And hopefully, by understanding the emotions, by understanding the beliefs and the thinking, the three things that make up any human moments, that you will slowly squash the imposter syndrome. But without self-reflection, without self-awareness and self-compassion, that's not going to happen. Is that your experience working with people yourself?
It is absolutely my experience, but I often get the question, how do I accelerate the process? I work with you and and I think many listeners who are hearing perhaps not famous for being patient. While it's patient with self is an important aspect, of course, what's the boundary, what's the patience? So I always say to people, how about collective, tapping into the power of collective resilience. You don't have to do everything alone. You don't have to go on this journey alone. So tap into it. What do I mean? I'm passionate about running mastermind groups, leadership inner circles. Why am I so passionate? Because I see what happens when a group of leaders, and I deliberately don't just say teams, it doesn't have to be within the organization. It can be a group of leaders that come together who have never met before, grow through this journey, and build this collective resilience where they're able to kind of, challenge their own thinking, recognize cognitive distortions, false beliefs. Don't believe all your thoughts that you have. Of course, the famous sentence. And committing together as well and viewing setbacks as not permanent. And it's much faster. It gives that perspective. The power of perspective is great. And of course, it takes longer and we never have this full self perspective. So having a coach, being in a sort of group coaching, leadership in a circles, mastermind groups, different forms. Please, please, please. I encourage everybody. You don't want you to imagine resilience as a sort of, I'm a superhero and climbing this mountain all by myself. Absolutely not. You're going to be much faster with others around, and you kind of minimize that recovery time that I talked about and we talked about at the beginning as well. It helps you to reframe. It's so important to have that perspective, that mirroring as well, and be open-minded where it comes from. Don't just think it's your managers, if your family or somebody. Be open-minded. Sharing experiences with other leaders from totally different industry is extremely powerful and increases that sort of resilience and accelerates that recovery time.
I think collective resilience is so important if we, as you said, move from the individual to the group. And that group does not have to be the team within a organization. Exactly what you said. I mean, running sort of experience-based discussions with professionals that come from different industry, different branches, and you bring them together. What it does, it allows them to share experiences, knowledges, and know-how, skills and strategies. First of all, if they fumbled the ball, how did they recover and what did they do? Or if they succeeded, how do they deal with the success, or how do they accelerate that success themselves? And when you talk to people from different industries, it's like using metaphors or analogies almost in that language, because people are bringing those experiences, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, is that what you do in your industry? I could apply that. So, because a lot of the time success and recovering from flops or failures is not a very industry specific. A lot of it comes down to the individual, the human being, and how he or she shows up to the game and how they move forward, regardless of how we characterize that experience. I mean, how about yourself? Is there something you've personally learned from sitting with leaders, and maybe a story or something, Agnes, that you recall?
Plenty. plenty. But I think just to, I always say where, sort of where focus goes, energy flows. So let's focus on some, I would say a blunt statement, perhaps: the higher you go, the lonelier it gets. And that is the sort of typical client customers that perhaps I deal with in terms of one-to-one coaching, not necessarily just the trainings, but one-to-one coaching. And how then who do you talk to? Who do you trust? How do you measure yourself? Where are those boundaries? No? So I think it's so important to have a routine. And find something that works for you. It doesn't have to be that works for everybody else. It can be a magic potion. I would say build your resilience magic potion together. It can be a combination of individual techniques. It can be a combination of group or engaging with others, or even having an individual coach. I mean, I often say that, magical as it is, I love to draw. If I feel that there are a lot of thoughts in my head, which happens to all of us, happens to all of our clients. I think I wouldn't be honest if I said I was not guilty of it. I often ask myself, choose one thought over another, Agnes. Come on, what is it that you're going to focus on? And then I draw this sort of my magic circle of, sort of power of control. What can you control? But really, I ask myself very honestly, what can I influence? And what is around. Now, very often I find, and I think customers also, and perhaps the listeners, that if you feel a bit tense, a bit more stressed, you're spending too much time focusing on things that you can't control. And I think zooming out is giving that perspective that, hold on, I'm heading into this thing that I can't control, and I'm so involved, and I'm hard on myself, and I'm having these meta emotions because now I'm even angry about the frustration about the thing. To zoom out is a really pause, breathe. These are not cliches. Now, have a routine for resilience. I do have a routine for resilience. And I think anybody who is a leader listening to this, leaders who want to create leaders, you should encourage, but it's not one fit all. Now, it's not about buy this book, do these 5 steps, but having I meditate, for example, in the morning. I take it slowly. I also do a lot of reflections during the day, perhaps, and breathe and take that pace and zoom out, even digitally. If you're sitting now perhaps with your laptop in front of you, just roll the chair back, do something, move, stand up. So make those changes. So important. Tiny, micro. I'm not talking about radically turn your life around in 5 minutes. This is not a magic potion. A magic potion in a way that with impact, that tiny micro changes, micro behavior changes starts with changing your thinking. So
it is. It's those tiny little movements, those tiny little actions that build up and they accumulate into habits, and they just become part of the regular pattern. Everything you speak to, I'm not going to elaborate in this podcast because of time, but there are certain brain functions, there are certain brain networks you're talking about. When people understand how the brain works based on the skills and methodologies that we speak about, and some of them we've shared today, it makes a radical difference. I mean, you literally rewire your brain, or in simple terms, we develop new default habits. We've talked about maybe putting together a retreat, to understand how to do this. And it would be an accumulation of what we've talked about in our workshops and our online workshops and such, and in our writings. And so the question is, if there's an interest out there for people to have such a retreat, perhaps what are some of your ideas about that?
Oh, love, this is music to my, that this is music to my ears for many reasons. Because I think when I run retreats, is I see the growth. Now, so the micro habits are good to, from the distance we can influence things. But when I have a group of people in a room together and I watch them to pass the comfort zone, because resilience doesn't live in your comfort zone. I think we can agree on that. So pass that fear zone now from the comfort zone, and a team that learns together, grows together. And what happens in the retreat is really we would be able to dive in to any elements, perhaps my 5+1 model, but we could dive into all those elements of self-leadership, empathy, deliberate and excellent communication, decision making. These are everyday challenges that I think leaders see. And of course, the biggest of it all is not just learning from us. I don't want people to imagine that we kind of sing and dance in the front the entire retreat. The retreat is about you, it's about the people who come. So it's about plenty of opportunity to learn from each other, that building that collaborative and collective intelligence and resilience. And most importantly, making human connection to experiential learning. I think that's what I love most about. So I love to take a picture, and perhaps I should, after so many years of running retreats, when they arrive and when they leave.
A little before and after.
A little before and after, because you don't need to be an expert, a coach, a body language expert, or a therapist to see the difference. Simply, and that comes from what we do both. We make people to think differently, and I love to share, to inspire. So that's the mission.
Yeah, I think in that recipe, right, the active ingredient is experience, and it's not just us. I mean, we create guidelines and facilitate, but I think the real learning comes from the people who learn from each other about their experiences, their know-how, and their knowledge of how they've come through a situation or a circumstance, whether positive or negative, but how do they handle it and how they incorporate that into their who they are, I guess, moving forward.
So how exciting. And I think it's a wonderful privilege, not just to be here again today, but of course working with you. And I'm really looking forward to creating more resilient moments, not just for ourselves, but for many around the world as well, whether it's retreat, whether it's writing, whether it's training. So
Well said. And I think this is a place where we can put the ... to be continued. Well, Agnes, that was a blast. It's always interesting to share words and thoughts with you. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Well, folks, that was the fantastic Agnes Cserhati. You know, today we talked about resilience and how it shows up. Resilience, as Agnes said, is not a superpower. We can all learn to be resilient. And first is self-awareness, is understanding where we are. What are our thoughts and our emotions? What are we doing at that moment? It's about self-compassion. It's about turning that kindness onto ourselves. And in our struggles and in our successes, these are human experiences. And millions of people have been through that. And the third point was self-efficacy. Now, as Agnes said, it's where you choose to place your attention. And as she works with clients, it's about focusing on what you control and what you influences. It's where you can invest your actions and efforts. And when we can do that, what that does, it infuses self-confidence, and it squashes self-critical thoughts, and it squashes self-doubt. And resilience is not a road that we need to walk alone. In Agnes's 5+1 model, she talks about network of teams, meaning that we can sit with professionals from other organizations, disciplines, and companies, and we can learn about their skills and stories and strategies, both facing success or facing struggles. Agnes has created a very encompassing and elegant model that she's called the 5+1 model. You can find a direct link in the show notes to her 5+1 model and article. And a little homework for you listeners out there. We are curious to know how many of you would be interested in a retreat to learn about some of the aspects and stories and skills when we talk about leadership, of dealing with struggles and dealing with success, finding personal resilience and also team resilience. So I will leave a link in the show notes for any of you who are interested, and if you'd like to leave a comment. But thank you for that, and thank you for showing up for another episode. We are at the tail end again, and as a call to action, if you could please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast and this episode, I'd really appreciate it. And if you could share this with 2 friends, 2 family members, and 2 colleagues, you'd be doing me a big favor. But until the next time we speak, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.